Darren learned early that people misread silence as permission to be careless. He stood just inside the visitor flow of the old brick museum with its high windows and polished stone floors that always looked slightly too clean. The place smelled like lemon cleaner and history, like someone had tried to scrub time itself into something orderly. Darren wore civilian clothes because he had trained himself to move through civilian spaces without announcing what he used to be. A plain dark jacket, work boots with scuffed leather, a canvas bag that looked like it carried nothing important. The only thing about him that gave away the weight he carried was that he watched everything. He did not watch in the way people did when they wanted to take photographs. He watched like a person checking for hazards that wouldn't show up in a brochure. Maribel led the group through the Modern Conflicts Gallery. Darren had arrived before she did because he always arrived early. He had promised himself he would not miss the part of the exhibit where the history would touch something he remembered too clearly. Maribel was one of those tour guides who could talk in full sentences without ever losing rhythm. Her voice moved smoothly from artifact to artifact, and her hands, when they gestured, made neat arcs, as if every sentence had an invisible frame. When she saw Darren lingering near the information panel, she tightened her smile by a fraction. "Sir," she said, still polite, "you can't stand here right by the rope line. You'll block the view." Darren looked at the rope, at the small gap of space the group needed, and then at her face. "I'm not blocking," he said. His voice was even. "I'm reading the label." Maribel leaned slightly toward the panel, and her expression suggested that reading was not the problem. The problem was that Darren didn't look like someone who belonged in the line. "It's okay," she said, as if she were correcting a child. "We're going to cover it in a minute." Darren nodded because he had learned that nodding could keep someone from making a bigger mistake out of you than out of themselves. He took one step to the side, but not far enough to move him away from the display. He kept his eyes on the panel. Caleb, the museum security supervisor, appeared a moment later, not rushing but not strolling either. His posture suggested he had been asked to deal with problems before. "Maribel," he said, "what's going on?" "Nothing," Maribel replied quickly. "He's just lingering. I told him he can't stand there. It's a flow issue." Caleb looked at Darren like he was scanning for the category of trouble he had been trained to recognize. Darren could almost feel the mental checklist: disruptive behavior, disrespect, the wrong kind of questions. Darren didn't ask for special treatment. He didn't reach into anything. He didn't raise his voice. He only waited until Maribel's explanation shifted away from the text on the panel. Then he leaned closer, not to the artifact, but to the label that sat beneath a glass case. The label described a field kit used during a specific operation. Darren had seen that kit, had seen it broken down and packed again, had seen it used with the kind of calm urgency that came from knowing that mistakes cost more than embarrassment. The label's wording was wrong in a way that mattered. It said the kit contained a particular component used for a task that required a different setup than the one the label implied. Darren recognized it the way a carpenter recognized a miscut board. You could still build something with it, but not the thing you thought you were building. Maribel continued her talk, oblivious to the way Darren's attention had sharpened. Darren waited for a natural pause. It came when Maribel took a breath before moving the group toward the next display. "Excuse me," Darren said. Maribel's smile became automatic again. "Yes, sir?" Darren kept his hands at his sides. "The label says the kit contained the—" He glanced at the text and then corrected himself, because quoting exactly was important. "The adapter for a certain calibration. That adapter isn't the one that would have been used for that job." A few visitors looked up from their shoes and phones. Maribel's eyes flicked to him. Caleb's attention locked in. Maribel's voice lowered by half a notch. "Sir, I'm giving the tour. We can't have every visitor stopping the group." Darren swallowed once, not from nerves but from restraint. He had once forced himself to swallow his own certainty because certainty could get someone killed. He didn't want to make a museum moment into something it wasn't. He chose a measured tone. "I'm not trying to stop the tour. I'm trying to stop a misunderstanding." Caleb took a small step forward. What misunderstanding? Darren didn't point at the glass case. He pointed at the printed label, just the edge, as if he were indicating a correction in a textbook. The exhibit calls it one component, but the version we used had to match the system it connected to. If a person reads that label and assumes the kit worked one way, they'll also assume the safety steps were optional. That's how mistakes happen. Maribel's face held for a moment in that careful way people held their composure when they felt challenged. "We have documentation," she said. "The museum's got records." Darren nodded again. "Records can be wrong. People are human even when they're careful." Maribel's smile thinned. "Sir, are you a veteran?" It wasn't an insult. It was a gate, and the way she asked it made it clear what she thought the answer would be. Darren considered telling the truth, not the loud kind, the simple kind, the kind that could be respected. He didn't say everything. He said enough to be honest without turning his story into a show. "I served," he said. Maribel exhaled as if that resolved nothing. "Then you should understand that we still have to rely on the official materials." Darren watched how her eyes avoided the exact words on the label. She wasn't refusing facts because she hated them. She was refusing because admitting she might be wrong risked making her look foolish in front of the group. And Darren knew that kind of fear. He had seen it, not in speeches, but in after-action reports where someone hid the cause and explained the symptoms. "Maribel," Caleb said, and his voice carried the authority of a man who had already decided this would become an issue. "Let's step aside, please." Darren didn't argue. The part of him that wanted to fight, the part that could feel the anger of being dismissed, held quiet. He had learned restraint could be stronger than confrontation. He stepped away with Caleb, and the rest of the group continued down the corridor. Caleb spoke low. "Sir, I don't know what you're trying to do, but you can't correct our staff in front of visitors." Darren kept his gaze level. "I wasn't correcting her as a person." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then what were you doing?" Darren chose his words carefully, as if each one were a tool he didn't want to drop. "Correcting the record." Caleb looked unimpressed. "Our staff are trained. If you've got a complaint, put it in writing." Darren nodded once. "I can do that." Caleb gestured toward the side area near the desk where visitors could fill out forms. "Good, because if you keep interrupting, you'll be removed." Darren walked toward the desk and he filled out a simple form with his name and contact information. He wrote the correction precisely. He didn't add drama. He didn't threaten. He simply described the mismatch he had noticed and the likely version that fit the exhibit's stated context. While he wrote, he felt the heaviness that came from knowing that the truth could exist while still not changing what people believed. He had been that kind of truth before, useful but ignored, necessary but treated like a disruption. When he finished, he placed the paper down and stepped back, waiting for something, anything, to be done. But museum days were not built around one veteran's quiet correction. The tours moved. Visitors asked cheerful questions. Staff smiled and redirected. Inside Darren, a small part of him kept checking the same dangerous line again. The wrong label could lead to the wrong assumption, and the wrong assumption could lead to a safety step being skipped. He followed the group back to the next section of the gallery. Maribel had resumed her talk with a steadier tone, as if she had reasserted control. She explained the next artifact: a worn protective case, a folded document folder, a set of markers. A teenager in the group, too young to remember the era the exhibit covered, asked whether the equipment was still used today. Maribel answered with a carefully worded line about how modern systems had updated. Then she moved on. Darren listened, not because he needed the explanation, but because he needed to know whether his correction would be taken somewhere behind the scenes, where it would matter. At some point, Maribel mentioned the kit again, connecting it to the labels. Her words matched the wrong information. Darren felt his restraint tighten into something almost painful, but he kept his posture neutral. He didn't step forward this time. He let the moment pass, because he wanted the truth to emerge through its own weight. Caleb noticed his stillness. Caleb noticed him hovering at the edge of the group again. "You!" Caleb said, pointed not rudely but with a supervisor's insistence. "Sir, you need to stay behind the rope line." Darren turned his head slowly, allowing the group to see he wasn't defiant. "I am behind it." Caleb looked. There was a fraction of space where the rope line met the floor seam, and Darren's boots were placed exactly where he could see the label without stepping over. Caleb exhaled, annoyed at being corrected by geometry. But he didn't want to look like he'd misread Darren. Maribel approached again, and her expression had shifted into something closer to caution. "We had a form," she said. "We already received your note." Darren nodded. "Then you know the problem." Maribel's voice went firm. "I don't know everything. I know we do research and fact-checking." Darren didn't argue. "Fact-checking can take time," he said. Maribel tilted her head. "Are you threatening the museum?" "No," Darren replied calmly. "I'm telling you what I saw and what the exhibit is saying." Caleb's attention turned to the visitors, as if he worried the situation would become too visible. He lowered his voice. "Sir, don't make this worse." Darren looked at the artifact display. He looked at the glass case where the kit rested behind a label. The truth he carried was not just about a component. It was about the person who had put that kit together. He remembered the afternoon the kit had been assembled at a temporary workbench under harsh light. He remembered the hands that had checked each part twice. He remembered how his own hands had been too unsteady at the start because his training had been shortened by injuries, and he had learned to compensate by being careful. He remembered the day the kit had gone out, how the unit had moved with the kind of discipline that didn't need speeches. He also remembered what came later. The paperwork, the debrief, the gap between what was logged and what was later remembered. The label in the museum reflected the paperwork. It reflected an official version that had been created under pressure. But it didn't reflect the physical reality of the kit they had packed. That discrepancy might have been small to anyone else. To Darren, it was the difference between a safety mechanism doing its job and a safety mechanism being assumed when it wasn't there. He had tried to correct it quietly. Now he watched the tour continue toward the next hall. Maribel led them to a larger display, a wall-mounted set of field maps with protective sleeves and a small audio station where visitors could hear archival excerpts. One of the visitors, a man with a camera, leaned in too close to the case. Darren saw it immediately. The visitor's elbow drifted toward a control panel that shouldn't have been touched by hands, because it activated a projector system behind a panel. A wrong touch could cause the projector to cycle, changing lighting levels briefly. It wasn't dangerous like a gun, but it was dangerous like a spotlight in the dark. It could force someone who needed to keep their attention on a moving obstacle to lose it. Darren stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold the visitor. He only spoke as if he were part of the exhibit's own instructions. "Don't touch that panel," Darren said. Maribel spun toward him instantly. Her expression had that look of someone who was tired of being made into the wrong person. "Sir," she said sharply, "you're not in charge." Caleb appeared at her side, moving faster this time because the moment felt less safe, not physically but socially, like the museum was losing control. The visitor with the camera pulled back, startled, and looked embarrassed. Maribel turned back to Darren. "You're causing a scene again." Darren looked at the panel and then at the label posted beside it. He could see the caution text, and he could see how it was easy to misread. He could see how staff had placed that control where it was visible. His restraint held. He didn't insist. He didn't accuse. He turned to Maribel and spoke with a steadiness that made people listen even when they didn't want to. "I know you're trying to keep the tour flowing," he said, "but the way it's set up, the panel can get activated by accident. That display needs to be operated by staff only. Your group is too close." Maribel's eyes widened slightly, not at the warning, but at the implication that she hadn't managed the situation well. She glanced at Caleb. Caleb glanced at her, silently asking whether to remove the man. Darren could feel how quickly a person could be pushed out once someone labeled them a troublemaker. He had lived inside that label before, in a different world, where people decided they already knew you from the surface. He didn't fight it with anger. He waited for the truth to become unavoidable. In the corner of the hall, there was a museum educator's podium. On it sat a portable tablet used to trigger the audio excerpts. Maribel's hand moved toward the tablet because she intended to demonstrate the next station. Darren watched her fingers hover. A second visitor, a woman with a stroller, stepped in closer, looking toward the audio station. The stroller's wheel edged too near the control panel's line of reach. Darren took one step forward again, then stopped. He didn't touch the equipment. He didn't grab the stroller. He didn't cause confusion. He only said, softer this time, more like a correction meant to prevent harm. Please hold the stroller back a foot. The woman blinked. What? Just back up a little, Darren repeated, and his voice carried no threat. The panel's touch-sensitive. It will trigger the projector and that might scare your child. It also distracts the group. Maribel snapped. Who are you to tell people how to stand? Caleb's expression became harder. Maribel, he said, and his tone made it clear he wanted this solved quickly. Darren looked at Maribel, and he let his answer be simple. I served, he said. Maribel's face tightened. That doesn't explain anything. Darren nodded as if he agreed. It explains why I noticed the details that make a difference. Then he did something that surprised everyone, not by volume but by choice. He turned away from the group and walked to the side of the hall, toward a small display labeled Artifact Handling Protocols, which most visitors ignored. Under the glass, there was a laminated card with procedures for staff. On the card was a handwritten name in faded marker, Darren's last name. He had never seen it on the museum card before. He didn't know how it had ended up there, but the name was his. It was also proof of something else. Someone had used his physical knowledge when drafting the safety and handling notes, even after he was no longer in that role. Maribel's eyes followed him reluctantly, as if she resented being made to witness something. Caleb followed too, a step behind, ready to stop Darren if he crossed into a staff-only area. Darren stood at the glass and read the card again, carefully. He didn't reach in. He didn't touch. He spoke to no one in particular, but his words landed like a weight. This museum used the handling protocol I wrote, he said. Maribel turned sharply. Those notes were created by staff. Darren didn't argue. No, he said, not the first draft. Caleb's face shifted as if he had just heard a name he couldn't place. Maribel looked at the card and then back at Darren. That's just a name, she said, but her voice no longer carried confidence. Darren lifted his chin slightly, as if he were acknowledging how people tried to keep distance from the truth when it threatened their assumptions. He spoke again, quietly. My name is Darren. That card is in my handwriting. I wrote it after the incident at... He stopped himself. He didn't want to say the incident's location out loud because that would turn the moment into a spectacle. But he also didn't want to lie. He chose a safer truth. I wrote it after a near miss, he said, and I gave it to the museum while you were still setting up this section. Maribel blinked. I was not here. Darren nodded. I know. The words sounded calm, but they were devastating. They implied she had been dismissed from the timeline that would have made her version of events make sense. Caleb looked at Darren with a more searching expression now, the kind of look people used when a simple category no longer fit. Maribel's mouth opened and closed. She had no quick explanation that could be both true and convenient. Darren's restraint remained intact. He didn't gloat. He didn't say, I told you so. Instead, he turned back to the exhibit label that had started the problem. He pointed, not to the glass case this time, but to the caption describing the field kit. The exhibit lists the calibration adapter wrong, he said. Maribel swallowed. Her eyes darted to the label again as if she expected it to have changed overnight. Caleb's voice came out rougher than it had earlier. Do you have documentation? Darren reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a folder. Not a dramatic folder, not a prop. A plain paper folder with worn edges. He took out a photocopied packet and a typed memo, simple documents, not movie-like. He handed the packet to Caleb. Caleb looked at the top page, then at the name on it. Then he looked up at Darren. Maribel leaned in, drawn despite herself. The top page carried a museum internal memo header, the museum's letterhead from years back, with Darren's name attached as contributor and annotator. Caleb's hands tightened around the paper. Maribel's shoulders lifted just slightly, like someone bracing for impact. Darren spoke quietly, letting the document speak first. I corrected the label once already, but the version in this case came from the earlier draft. The official record got updated. The exhibit didn't. Maribel's voice was small. How do you know that? Darren looked at her without anger. Because I was in the room when we made that correction to the record, he said. That made the air change. It made the visitors stop moving. It made even the museum staff around them shift in place. They weren't just hearing a claim. They were hearing that the correction wasn't theoretical. It was personal, procedural, and documented. Caleb stepped back slightly, as if the ground had tipped. Darren, he said slowly, tasting the name like he wanted to get it right. What unit were you assigned to during that period? Darren's gaze moved to the artifact and then to the display's caption, as if he were checking whether he should say more. He didn't want to expose himself for attention, but the moment demanded truth, and not because Darren wanted it, because the lie of dismissal had already taken root in the room. I was assigned as a... He stopped. He corrected himself, choosing the accurate term even if it wouldn't impress anyone. I was a systems specialist supporting the field teams. Not combat, not leadership. Support, maintenance, verification. Maribel looked confused for a moment, then she seemed to understand something. So your job was the details? Darren nodded. The details, he confirmed. Maribel's face tightened with embarrassment, but not the loud kind. This was the kind that stayed inside the chest. Caleb exhaled. We had complaints, he admitted, still holding the packet, about people interrupting tours. Darren's expression stayed steady. I wasn't trying to interrupt, he said. I was trying to prevent something from being taught wrong. Maribel's voice came out sharper than she meant. You still could have gone through staff. I did, Darren replied. Then he pointed at the form he had filled out earlier. You got my correction request. I gave it in writing. Maribel's eyes went to Caleb, and Caleb's glance confirmed what she didn't want to realize. Darren wasn't an impulsive troublemaker. He was a person who had done exactly what a respectful citizen would do. Her defensiveness had never been about policy. It had been about discomfort, about how it felt to be questioned by someone who didn't look like authority. The exhibit continued to sit behind the glass. The visitors remained in place. Someone's phone lowered. A woman in the group, an older woman with gray hair, spoke quietly. So he wasn't... Maribel looked at her, and for the first time her voice turned gentle. No, Maribel said. He wasn't. But the word sounded like it cost something. Caleb turned to the group and lifted the memo as if it were suddenly relevant in a way that made the museum itself visible. This is the handwriting from our protocol. Maribel looked at Darren. Why didn't you tell me who you were? Darren's answer came without bitterness. Because I didn't want you to listen because I was impressive, he said. I wanted you to listen because it was correct. Maribel's eyes glistened, but she didn't let tears make it a spectacle. A quietness settled into the room so thick it felt like a blanket. Then Darren did something almost imperceptible. He reached into his bag and pulled out a thin, folded item, a cloth that looked like it had been kept for a long time. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a small patch with a unit name and a date. He didn't wave it. He held it flat against his palm, close to his chest, so only nearby visitors could see. Caleb stared. That patch, he said. Darren nodded once. It was photographed for the exhibit catalog. Maribel's voice was barely audible. And the label is wrong. Darren looked at her, at the visitors, and then at the glass case. He spoke the truth the way people spoke in places where mistakes couldn't be undone. "The label can be fixed," he said. "But what you teach matters. The way you teach safety matters." Caleb's posture changed. He straightened as if he had been corrected too. He turned toward Maribel. "We'll halt this section's interpretation," he said. "Call the curator. Bring them the correction we just got." Maribel nodded quickly. She looked at Darren again with the kind of respect people usually saved for those they believed belonged in their own category. Darren didn't accept her respect like a gift. He accepted it like a responsibility, because he knew how easy it was to feel ashamed in a moment and then move on without changing anything. After the group moved on under Caleb's direction, under a corrected, careful narration, Darren remained near the display longer than he needed to. He watched people drift toward new artifacts. He watched them read labels with less certainty, more thought. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired in a way that had been earned long before the museum. Later, when the hall calmed down, Caleb met Darren by the staff desk. Maribel lingered behind, giving space the way people did when they were trying not to crowd an apology. Caleb spoke first. "I'm sorry for how we handled it." Darren's expression softened, but not into forgiveness that would be too quick. "It was handled like you were protecting the tour," he said. Caleb nodded. "But it wasn't protection. It was dismissal." Darren looked down at his boots. "I've been dismissed for smaller reasons," he admitted. Caleb leaned forward slightly. "What happened to you?" Darren's instinct was to avoid that question, not because he wanted privacy as a shield, but because he didn't want his pain to become the museum's new entertainment. He had promised himself he would keep his truth grounded. "I lost my stability," he said finally. "Not all at once. It was like something you don't notice until it's gone." Maribel shifted her weight. "You live nearby?" Darren looked at her, then away to the wall where a framed photograph showed uniformed men with faces like people carved from determination. "I don't have an address that stays," he said. "Sometimes I rent a room. Sometimes I stay with someone who doesn't ask too many questions." Caleb's face tightened because the answer changed the room. It turned the label of troublemaker into a different kind of context. "It's not fair," Maribel said quietly. Darren's eyes moved to hers. "Fairness isn't the point," he replied. "Safety is. Details are." Caleb nodded. "And dignity." Darren's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "Dignity is what people do when they stop pretending they know you already." Maribel looked down, then back up. "You corrected that label today because you cared," she said. Darren nodded. "I cared before I walked in," he said. "I cared when I filled out the form, and I cared when I thought you wouldn't listen." Caleb folded the memo packet carefully and placed it into a folder. "We'll update it," he promised. Darren looked at the desk, at the forms and pens, at the quiet bureaucracy that could either help or fail, depending on whether people used it as a tool or as an excuse. "I don't want it to just be updated in a way no one notices," Darren said. Caleb's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Darren turned slightly toward the exhibit hall and indicated the placard. "Update it where it's visible, and train staff to listen when someone is calm. Calm people notice details. It doesn't mean they're looking for trouble." Maribel nodded quickly. "We can do that." Caleb glanced at Maribel, then back at Darren. "There are records of the corrections you made," he said. "We'll pull them." Darren didn't ask for credit. He didn't want to be called a hero for doing his job. But he did want the system to acknowledge the person behind the detail. That was the kind of redemption he could accept. Not applause, but accuracy. While they discussed updates, a museum intern approached, carrying a small set of printouts. "Caleb," the intern said, "we found the earlier draft in the archive." Caleb straightened. "Show me." The intern handed him papers. Caleb read the first page, then his eyes widened. Maribel leaned closer. Darren watched without interrupting. The intern's voice softened. "The earlier draft had the correct adapter name. Then it was revised and someone—" Caleb lifted his hand, stopping the intern from guessing. Someone revised it for the catalog, he said. But the exhibit label got left on the older version. Maribel looked at Darren as if she were seeing the sequence of events she couldn't erase. So you weren't just arguing? Darren's answer was quiet. I wasn't arguing. He paused, then added, I was remembering. Later that afternoon, a curator arrived. The curator didn't make speeches. He came with the practical urgency of someone who had just realized an exhibit had been corrected in a way they hadn't seen yet. He greeted Caleb and then greeted Darren with something close to humility. Mr. Darren, the curator said. Darren corrected him gently. Darren is fine. The curator nodded, grateful for simplicity. We reviewed the material, he said. The label is wrong. The catalog copy we used was updated. The case label wasn't. Maribel stood with her hands folded, listening. She looked like someone who had been handed proof and was learning how to hold it without turning it into a defense. Caleb looked at Darren. Do you want to help us verify the other labels? Darren hesitated. He could feel the old fear that asking for help would become another trap. People would use him as a tool and then forget him again when the job was done. But he also recognized a different posture in Caleb and the curator. They weren't trying to win the conversation, they were trying to fix the problem. Darren nodded once. If you want, he said. The curator's smile was restrained. We do. Maribel exhaled like she had been holding her breath for hours. You shouldn't have been treated that way, she said to Darren. Darren looked at her, the museum lights reflecting faintly off the glass displays in the hallway. He did not deny her. He did not accept it as permission to move on without consequence. You can't always know someone's story, he said, but you can always know what you saw and how you reacted. That's where your responsibility is. Maribel nodded, swallowing again. I reacted like I assumed you were there to cause trouble. Darren's eyes were steady. It's an easy assumption, he said. It's also a dangerous one. Maribel's voice softened. I won't make it again. Darren didn't ask her to promise. He trusted actions more than promises. He believed in restraint because restraint was what carried a person through when emotions would have turned everything into noise. Before Darren left the museum that day, Caleb walked him toward the front doors. The building's outside air hit like a reminder that the world didn't pause for truth. Caleb spoke quietly. We can help with a contact if you need services. Darren understood the offer. He had heard it before from people who wanted to feel useful without changing their own comfort. He didn't reject it harshly. He didn't accept it like someone begging. He chose a middle path. Dignity without refusal. Gratitude without dependence. I'll take a list, he said. Not because I think you'll save me, because I want to do something myself. Caleb nodded. That's fair. As Darren stepped out into the afternoon, he expected the world to return to its usual pattern. Cars, foot traffic, strangers who would not notice the difference between a person who was trouble and a person who was trying to keep others safe. He expected to feel alone again, but that was the subtle part. He didn't feel alone in the way he usually did. Because in that museum hall, the room had gone quiet for a reason. Not because Darren had performed, because he had told the truth. And the truth, quiet, specific, documented, had silenced the easy assumptions. As he walked toward the parking lot, he heard the last echo of Caleb's voice from inside, calling Maribel to bring the printouts to the curator. The museum doors shut behind him with a final, ordinary click. But Darren carried a different sound with him. Recognition. Not the kind that erased what had happened to him, the kind that honored who he still was. He kept walking, shoulders steady, hands relaxed, eyes forward. He didn't feel like a headline. He felt like a man who had corrected a dangerous mistake and finally been seen for it. And for once, the world around him didn't pretend it hadn't happened. Neutral studio background, soft lighting, photorealistic.